We're going to take a little closer look at the African evidence and see if we can not just pinpoint the origins of sapiens on the basis of the skeletal remains, like those from Kivish at 195,000, 200,000 years ago, or Classy's river mouth in South Africa, but to look at what evidence there is for early modern human behavior. And this is an area in which more and more emphasis is being directed. Not a lot of work has focused on Africa to look at sites where there might be evidence of what we would really consider human behavior, like making bone artifacts or making blade tools or decorating things, or maybe even early signs of perhaps art of some kind. We know there's rock art all over Africa, but it's very recent. And you would expect that because there aren't many caves where people would be going into, like the caves in Europe, and painting inside those caves. They would be doing it more out in the open or in rock overhangs that are both subjected to erosion and weathering. So if there were paintings that went back, say, 80,000 years or 100,000 years, they would have certainly eroded away or weathered away by now. So we have to look for other sorts of information. There's a well-known cave in South Africa, on the South African coast, east of Cape Town, as you see, called Blombos. And it has been dated using uranium dating and other thermoluminescence and so on, some of the other dating methods, at about 70,000 years before present. And it's a wonderful cave, as you can see. You can excavate in there and you can look out onto the Indian Ocean. And bone points, as well as other bone tools, have been found at the site. And you can clearly see that these are bones that have been worked specifically to have a very sharp point on them and to be used in hunting. So that bone is something that, remember, Neanderthals really didn't make things with, and takes a very special technique to produce them. And this is one little clue to early modern human behavior. The other discovery at Blombos was the discovery of a block about that long of ochre. This is a soft iron oxide that can be used to color things, and was even used by Neanderthals probably to decorate their bodies and to maybe include with burials and stuff like that. But the one from Blombos, as you can see, is very carefully cross-hatched. And that is intentional. That is due to human behavior. Some human held that in his or her hand 70,000 years ago, and with a sharp point, maybe one of the bone points, maybe just a stone point, and made these X marks and did them over and over. So you see that they are re-engraved, as if when they wore away, they re-engraved them again. And as I think I may have mentioned before, this may very well be a stamp. Rather than using a stamp and an ink pad, they wet the surface of this block with water and then stamp their bodies with it, or bodies of other members of their clan. So it may be early body decoration. The other thing is that at Blombos more recently, Christopher Henshelwood, who is an archaeologist who is working at the site, has found containers that have different colors in them. There's like a little color set of soft pigments of slightly different ochre colors. So it looks like they were very intentionally collecting these different color minerals and using them. Now, the most comprehensive and overarching and multidisciplinary approach to this is taking place, probably as you're watching this, at Pinnacle Point, which is located, this is the site of Pinnacle Point, which is located not far from the town of Mossel Bay, which is right on the garden route at the tip of southern Africa, as far away from Europe as you could possibly get. And there is a major National Science Foundation supported research project, also a number of private foundations like the Hyde Family Foundation and others that are supporting this work under the direction of a man named Curtis Marion. And what you're looking at are extensive excavations in these caves, which are filled with sediments, tools, bones, etc., by people who lived there, maybe as much as 80, 100, 150,000 years ago. These are caves that are above sea level. They've never been below sea level. So they've never been cleaned out, fortunately. Even when most of the glaciers were gone and sea levels rose more, they never rose high enough to clean them out. So this is an absolutely undisturbed sequence of occupation layers. And you see people excavating and recording the discoveries. Now, on the left is Dr. Curtis Marion, who is a member of the Institute of Human Origins here at Arizona State University, and has a multinational transdisciplinary research project at Pinnacle Point. And he has uncovered a number of things. Lots of pieces of ochre, as you see on the right. Here's just a few examples of those. And they show striations as if they've been rubbed to maybe make a soft powder to use it. And they find hundreds, maybe thousands of these things. So they were very active in using this ochre, and they would have used it for body painting. Body painting would, of course, have enhanced interpersonal relations. I really recognized that once when I was at a wedding in southern Kenya, in a Maasai village, and they use ochre a great deal today. And I felt like the outsider till a woman came up and took ochre and painted my face. And I felt like I was part of the ceremony. They didn't have mirrors, so this was a very intimate sort of interaction between people. Also at the site, Curtis has found good evidence of heat treatment of rock. He found a bunch of artifacts, stone artifacts, made of something called silcrete, which is a quartz-like rock. And if you try to make a stone tool, it just shatters. But if you heat treat it for a certain length of time to a certain temperature with a certain kind of wood, it actually homogenizes it and tools can be made. And we thought that was an innovation in Europe. But here it is maybe 100 or 150,000 years ago in southern Africa. A real engineering breakthrough in terms of technology. And there are other signs of modern human behavior here. They're living on a very mixed diet. They're living during a particular period when Africa was very much a desert, all of Africa, except certain refuge areas. And this tip of South Africa may have been one of those refuge areas. Mossel in Afrikaans means mussel, and they collected mussels like crazy, so they had a lot of meat, a lot of protein, and they probably subsisted on tubers, subterranean organs of a very special group of plants called fynbos. So this is a very important site, and I look forward to much more coming out of these excavations at Mossel Bay. Now, in the past, people have argued between two different models of how humans appeared. One of them was called the regional continuity model. In fact, it goes back all the way to Franz Weidenreich, who you may remember from Homo erectus days. And he suggested that there was a common ancestor down here, and that it evolved into Homo erectus in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia. Well, we don't have any erectus fossils from Australia. And in Europe, it's questionable whether erectus was really there. And that more or less independently, with some gene flow going back and forth between these populations in sort of like a lattice pattern, that in Europe, erectus evolved into Neanderthals here, and then into modern humans. And in Asia, they evolved in various intermediate stages into Asians, and in Africa into modern Africans. This was a model proposed in the early 1900s, and evidence for the regional continuity model came with discoveries in present-day Israel. Like Skul and Kafsa, it was thought that these kinds of skulls were transitional, that they showed some sapiens characters, but reminiscences of what Neanderthals looked like. Like Neanderthals had those projecting faces and brow ridges, which you can see in School 5. Now, and here is a picture of, a close-up picture of COFSA 10, and you can see it really doesn't look much like a Neanderthal from the facial view, and it is today put into the species Homo sapiens. So these are probably Homo sapiens skulls, but initially, when the dating was not terribly clear, it was thought that this was evidence that Neanderthals evolved into anatomically modern humans. In other words, Homo neanderthalensis evolved into Homo sapiens. So that Tabun, Kabara, and Amud, which are clearly Neanderthals, were older, and Homo sapiens skulls like COFSA and School were younger. Now, there's been much more careful dating and examination of the sequences in Israel, which shows that in Tabun, you have a Neanderthal at 120,000 years or something like that. Then you have COFSA and School, which are sapiens, and then you have Amud and Kabara as Neanderthals again. So you don't evolve from Neanderthals to sapiens to Neanderthals. Does this mean perhaps that Neanderthals were migrating into and out of the Middle East? Maybe at very cold periods of time, they sought refuge in a warmer area which was offered to them in this area of Israel. So it certainly does not support the regional continuity model. The other model that we were interested in looking at is what's called the out of Africa model. We know there are several out of Africas, right? There was one about 1.8 million. There's one about 100,000 years ago. There probably were others we haven't detected. And finally, one about 45, 50, or maybe 60,000 years ago when everybody in the planet came out of Africa. So what this means is that something like African Homo heidelbergensis, which, as I said, might be Homo rhodesiensis, but something like that was the ancestor to our own species, Homo sapiens, that evolved in Africa. And that happened, I don't have any dates on this, but at least 200,000 years ago. And we didn't appear in Europe till about maybe 45,000 years ago. So this is a replacement model. This is a model where you don't have parallel evolution, which I think was a bit of a stretch. But here you have Africans coming out of Africa, and wherever they went, they replaced local populations. They replaced Neanderthals in Europe, they replaced Erectus in Asia, and so on. So this is the most widely held view of the origins and distribution of sapiens out of Africa, and is held by most anthropologists today. Now, Homo sapiens does, yes, show up at different times. It's what you would expect. You would expect it to appear earliest in its area of origin, i.e. Africa, and then a little bit later in places like Europe, and a little bit later in places like Asia, and a little bit later in places like Australia, and a little bit later in places like North and South America. The genetic and molecular evidence suggests that we all bear in common progenitor genes, early genes that came out of Africa that we would call African genes. And we see this in the nuclear DNA as well as in the mitochondrial DNA. And we know that Neanderthals were evolving in a very different direction in Europe. And while there might have been some admixture, as we know there was, they were very distinctly different in their majority of genes. One of the questions that's come up is if there has been mating between sapiens and Neanderthals, as we know there was, were there hybrids? Well, there's a lovely child's skeleton here, 24,000 years old, from Portugal, that shows human and Neanderthal-like features. And the Neanderthal-like features are probably evident to you in those short leg segments below the knee. Is this an individual that was simply Homo sapiens. It was adapted to a cold environment. Certainly it's too late for a hybrid anyway, because Neanderthals would have died out around 40,000 years ago, and there would not have been enough Neanderthal genes hanging around to 24,000 years for there to be a hybrid. And hybrids normally are not just sort of a modern-looking skull and a Neanderthal-like looking postcranial. You would see the mixture throughout the body. So the rapid replacement model, or the out of Africa model, suggests that Homo sapiens arose in Africa, in the Middle East, long before Eurasia. And these are the potential dates. Now, were those 92,000-year-old Homo sapiens the ones that gave rise to modern humans? Or did they come with the wave that came out about 50,000 years ago? So there's still lots to do, but the rapid replacement model is certainly our best model for understanding the origins of our species. And the world variation is relatively small, suggesting small founder populations. Africans show the greatest variation in genetics, which means that they have been evolving there in Africa the longest time. And we do have a common ancestor because we share these progenitor genes. And I don't think Neanderthal erectus could have contributed to Homo sapiens. So with this beautiful picture of southwest France, the Dordogne area where Cro-Magnon was found and so on, we're going to, in the next lecture, move on to trying to put together kind of an understanding of what the human family tree looks like, as confusing as it might be.